Let us discuss the vertebral column. So this is actually part 2 in our series on the mammalian skeleton. In part 1, we discussed the cranium, ribcage, and sternum. Now let's dive into it. Now, the vertebral column is made up of small bones called vertebrae. A single one is referred to as vertebra. So in mammals, we have 33 vertebral bones extending from the neck region to the lower back. Now, what happens is that in between two vertebrae, you're going to have this disc of cartilage. It's known as the intervertebral disc. So, between every two vertebrae, you have the intervertebral disc. Now, this has three main functions. Function number one is that it acts as a shock absorber. So, essentially, it absorbs any stress or force that is exerted on the vertebral column. Now, in our daily life, we undertake certain activities such as walking, running, jumping, bending. We do so regularly. Now, these can put some stress on the vertebral column. Now, in order to protect these bones, you have the intervertebral discs absorbing the force and distributing it evenly. Function number two is that they reduce friction. Now, friction occurs when you have two surfaces rubbing against one another. If we didn't have this cartilage, what would have happened is that you're going to have two vertebrae rubbing against one another. As you can imagine, over time, this will cause a lot of wear and tear and pain. Fortunately, this is reduced by the presence of the intervertebral discs. And the last function is that the intervertebral discs make the vertebral column to be flexible by allowing a small degree of movement. Okay, bones by themselves are not flexible and therefore they cannot move. But by having the cartilage, what happens is that they allow a small, limited movement of the vertebral column. So this allows us to bend forward, twist, tilt from side to side. All of these as a result of the cartilage discs. And that is that on the intervertebral discs. Now, when it comes to the vertebrae, are they all the same? Of course not. They have variations in terms of their structure based on the location of where they're found. So we have 5 main groups of vertebrae. Starting with the first one, cervical vertebrae. These are found in the neck region and they are 7 in number. Thoracic vertebrae are found in the thoracic region, the upper back, and they are 12 in number. Lumbar are found in the lumbar region, the lower back. These are 5 in number. We have sacral, 5, 2, caudal are 4. Now, before we discuss each of these vertebrae, I want us to discuss the typical structure of a vertebral bone. Now, this structure is going to have a basic plan. They're going to have certain parts that are present among all vertebrae, although you're going to have variations. So, this is the structure and these are the parts. Let's start with the centrum. Now, the centrum is a solid structure that has the function of supporting the weight of the vertebra. So when it comes to the centra, what happens is that they fit into the intervertebral discs on both sides. Okay. The next part is the transverse processes. These are projections that arise from the side of the vertebra. So they provide a surface area for attachment of muscles. Moving on to the next one, the neural canal. Now, the neural canal, by the way, when you hear the term canal, it simply means an area that is, it's hollow to allow the passage of something. So, in the case of the neural canal, it allows for the passage of the spinal cord. So, the spinal cord passes through the neural canal, and by doing so, it protects the spinal cord from mechanical damage. Okay, we also have the neural spine. Now, this provides a site for attachment of muscles. Next one, we have the facets. Facets are also known as zygapophyses. I know, yeah? So, these are small, flat, and smooth surfaces that are found at the front and back of the vertebra. So, this is the point whereby you're going to have one vertebra articulating with another. So when you talk about the word articulating, this simply means whereby you're going to have one bone joining with another. So remember, the vertebrae are going to articulate with one another, leading to the formation of the long continuous structure that is known as the vertebral column or the backbone. So it is at the facets where you're going to have one vertebra articulating with another. Now, the facets that are found at the front of the vertebra are known as pre-zygapophyses. So these articulate with the facets of the vertebra above, as you can see. Now, the facets that are found at the back are known as post-zygapophyses. Okay, these are found at the back at the posterior end, and they articulate with the facets of the vertebra below it, such that you end up having the pre-zygapophyses of one vertebra articulating with the post-zygapophyses of the successive vertebra, and so on. So what are the general functions of the vertebrae? There are two. Number one is that they protect the spinal cord, of course. And number two is they provide a surface area for attachment of muscles. Now, when it comes to the vertebrae, we are going to discuss them according to their location as mentioned before. So our first start is going to be the cervical vertebrae. So these are vertebrae that are found in the neck region, and they are 7 in number. Now, these share certain characteristics that are in common with one another, of course, but the first two cervical vertebrae are so very different from the remaining 5, and as such, they are assigned unique names. So the first one is referred to as the atlas, and the second one is referred to as the axis. The remaining 5 are simply referred to as cervical vertebrae, and they have structures that are similar to one another. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to first discuss the characteristics of the 5 cervical vertebrae and then proceed to the atlas and the axis. So let us start with the cervical vertebrae. Now, these have one unique characteristic that is not found in any other vertebrae. So this characteristic is only going to be found in the 7 cervical vertebrae, including the axis and the atlas. And this is the presence of the vertebraterial canals. So these are openings that are found on the transverse section on either side, and they are, small openings that allow for the passage of the vertebral artery. Now, this is one of the main arteries that supplies blood rich in oxygen and nutrients to the brain. So the vertebraterial canals provide a passage for the vertebral artery. So this is a distinctive characteristic that is present in all 7 cervical vertebrae, only in this. Now, whenever you have a practical and you're provided either with an actual specimen or with a photograph of a bone and you're told to identify which is it, your first starting point should be looking at the presence of these canals. Are they present? Then you're dealing with a cervical vertebra. If it's absent, then it could be any other. Now, another characteristic of the cervical vertebrae is that they have transverse processes that are broad and branched to provide a large surface area for the attachment of neck muscles. Now, when it comes to the appearance of the transverse processes of the 5 cervical vertebrae, it's quite distinct. So you're going to note that their transverse processes are bilobed. Okay, I want you to look at the tip. You will note that the tip, in most cases when it comes to the cervical vertebrae, is split at the end to form these 2 lobes. Now, this is an adaptation to increase the surface area for attachment of muscles. So, as such, it's present in the 5 cervical vertebrae. Another characteristic, a wide neural canal. In fact, you're going to note that when it comes to all 7 cervical vertebrae, they have a neural canal that is quite wide compared to the others. And the reason for this is for the passage of the spinal cord that is wider at the neck region than in the other regions. Now, the reason is because at the neck region, you're going to have a lot of nerve cells, a lot of neurons in this region that will add on to the bulk of the spinal cord. So you're going to need a wider neural canal to accommodate for their passage. So the remaining 2 characteristics, you're going to have a centrum that is wide and thick to provide support to the adjacent vertebra. You're also going to have a neural spine that is broad but short. So this provides additional surfaces for attachment of muscles. And those are the characteristics of the cervical vertebrae. Now moving on to the atlas. So the atlas is the first cervical bone. This is the first bone of the cervical vertebrae as well as the first bone of the vertebral column. Now, when you look at the atlas, you will note that it's going to articulate at 2 points, at the anterior and at the posterior, at the front and the back. So at the anterior, nearer the head, it's going to articulate with the occipital condyles. So these are smooth surfaces that are found at the base of the skull. We discussed this a lot in the first video, so if you haven't checked it out, please do so. So we have these smooth surfaces that are found at the base of the skull. They are referred to as occipital condyles. This is the point where the atlas articulates with the cranium to form a joint, of course. Now, when you talk about bones, bones join with one another at a certain point. So when a bone joins with another, this is what is termed as articulation. This, of course, results in the formation of a joint. So in this case, the occipital condyles articulate with the facets of the atlas to form a joint, and this joint is very, very important because it allows us to nod our head. Okay? Now, this joint is present at the anterior of the atlas. At the posterior of the atlas, you're also going to have the atlas articulating with another bone. In this case, it's going to be the second cervical bone, and that is the axis. So at the posterior end, the atlas articulates with the axis to form a joint that allows us to rotate our head, to turn our head side to side. So in short, the joint that the atlas forms with two different other bones allows us to both nod our head and turn it side to side. How amazing is this, right? Okay. So what are the distinctive features of the atlas? These are the features that set it apart from other vertebrae. Number one is that it has a wide neural canal. Now, I know I just mentioned that all cervical vertebrae have a wide neural canal. But did you know that the atlas has the widest neural canal of all? Yes, it does. And this is an adaptation to accommodate the large spinal cord in the neck region. Another feature of the atlas is that it has transverse processes that are broad and wing-like as such to provide a large surface area for attachment of the neck muscles. Next, it has broad facets. Remember what we said about facets? These are the point of articulation of one vertebra with another bone. So it has broad facets for articulation with the occipital condyles to form a joint that allows for the nodding of the head. Now, two other characteristics of the atlas: it has no centrum, and lastly, it has a small neural spine. And that is that regarding the atlas. Moving on to the axis. So the axis is the second cervical vertebra, and as with the atlas, it has such a unique structure that it deserves its own name. Now, the axis articulates also with two bones, at the anterior end and at the posterior end. So of course, at the anterior of the axis, it's going to articulate with the atlas. Remember, you have the atlas at the top and then the axis below it. So at the anterior end, you're going to have the axis articulating with the atlas. At the posterior end, you're going to have the axis articulating with the third cervical vertebra as such. So what are the distinctive features of the axis? Number one, the most distinctive feature that is not present in any other vertebra is the odontoid process. Now, when it comes to the axis has a centrum that is broad. Now, this is actually one of the structural differences present between the atlas and the axis. When it comes to the atlas, it has no centrum. But when it comes to the axis, not only does it have a centrum, its centrum is broad and projects upwards to form a structure that looks like a peg as such. This structure is known as the odontoid process. Now, the odontoid process fits into the neural canal of the atlas to form a joint. This joint is very important because it allows us to rotate our head side to side as such. Are we together? What other characteristics of the axis are there? Number two, it has a wide neural canal, for the passage of the large spinal cord, and it also has a neural spine that is broad but short to provide a large surface area for attachment of muscles. Lastly, its transverse processes are also wing-like to provide a large surface area for attachment of muscles. By the way, this is something that you're going to see repeated again and again because it comes back to the general functions of the vertebrae. All vertebrae have a purpose of providing a surface for the attachment of muscles. It's just a matter of where. Are we talking about the neck muscles, the back muscles, the abdominal muscles as such? And that is that on the cervical vertebrae.